We're expecting about 70 of you online, so it's fantastic that you're coming in. So just in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, if you'd like to put who's your mob and where are you from? We love to hear the variety of people online. And of course, if we just ask you to keep your mics off during the process, that would be fantastic. We're really, really excited to have you all online, and we know this is going to be a wonderful masterclass. I will acknowledge too that we're recording today's session, and that the intent of that is to keep you up to date and also to provide you with a recording at the end if you'd like to look at that again. As you know, this is a member-only event, so it's really important for us to give value to our members through the masterclass series. So, in the interests of time, I will get going and open up this morning with acknowledging country, acknowledging on our side of the country, we're on beautiful Whadjuk lands of the Noongar Nation. And we know this is indeed a national event today, so can I take a moment to acknowledge all countries that you're joining us from today, and also make a special acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are on the call today, and also to our allies who stand and walk this journey with us and continue to do important work. So thank you. We've just clicked over into the season of Gilbert. You can probably feel the seasons have shifted slightly. It feels a tiny bit warmer than it was a few weeks ago. So just really want to acknowledge the beautiful season we're in as well. So today's masterclass is called Reconciliation at Work, Truth-Telling for Action. I'm really excited about this masterclass because I had the absolute privilege of meeting Josh Gilbert, who is also the co-chair of Reconciliation New South Wales, when the Australian Reconciliation Network came together earlier this year. Josh is an incredible leader, and I just want to talk a little bit about this program and what we're intending to achieve. So he's the co-director at the Centre for Indigenous People and Work, and this will be another very innovative masterclass that you'll learn a huge amount from. This session is delivered in collaboration with the Centre for Indigenous People and Work, a joint collaboration between UTS Chambara Institute and the Business School, University of Technology Sydney, that is. The Centre for Indigenous People and Work seeks to reclaim the Indigenous employment narrative, speaking truth to Indigenous workplace experiences. Drawing upon the Centre's national survey, Gariyala, which surveyed over 1,100 Indigenous people, and recent analysis on Indigenous pay, this session will provide an understanding of the current state of workplaces for Indigenous people. We intend today to help you understand the truth about Indigenous workplace experiences, explore the impact of reconciliation action plans in the workplace, understand the work needed towards Indigenous pay parity, and also learn what activities work to create change. This, as we said, is a member-only event, so we're really proud to bring the value and quality of this experience to you all. I'm going to introduce our wonderful new membership and program lead now, and that is Astrid Bieber-Cooper. We're delighted to welcome Astrid. She's in her third week with us now, and she's hit the ground running. Astrid has amazing experiences from a whole range of sectors and strong marketing and stakeholder engagement background. And Astrid is come in and to support all our members across our network. And of course, I will just do a quick shout out that we're in renewal season. So if you've not yet renewed your membership, we would love you to do that as soon as possible. I'm also joined by my colleague Michelle, who's our partner and programs lead, who will be facilitating the chat. Please, as we go, you can put feedback into the chat. You can put questions into the chat, and I know Josh would be pleased to round back to those. But now I'm going to hand to Astrid, and she will do the formal introduction of Josh, and then Josh will take over this morning. Over to you, Astrid.
Kaya Wanju, thank you, Jodie. I echo your acknowledgement and being in this Gilbert season at the moment where it's very interchangeable at the moment on where we are just down the road from Katakumba, and today's raining. Yesterday was sunny and stunning, so typical sort of Gilbert day. So yes, thank you. We are welcoming, it's all about Josh Gilbert today and his amazing background and experience. So I'll read, because he does have a very long, wonderful background, I'll read a little bit about Josh and hand it over to him. So Josh is a socially and commercially focused Warrama man with over a decade of experience in the agricultural sector, specialising in Indigenous agriculture work in sustainability and Indigenous employment. And I believe that you're in Newcastle, Josh, which I'm sure he'll explain further when he comes on. He has over a decade of board experience across community organisations, state and federal government boards, and advisory committees and multi-billion-dollar corporations. He currently serves on the boards of Indigenous Business Australia and the New South Wales Aboriginal Housing Office, and is the Aboriginal co-chair of Reconciliation New South Wales, as Jodie mentioned. In 2025, he launched his first book, Australia's Agricultural Identity, an Aboriginal Yarn, narrating Indigenous agricultural concepts and their meaning in the current agricultural fields. He has some other amazing achievements. He's been named Australian Geographic's Young Conservationist of the Year. He shot a documentary with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, was a Young Australian of the Year finalist, and shares his Aboriginal wisdom with audiences, such as his TEDx Canberra presentation. In 2021, he was announced as the Nature Conservation Council's Rising Star and in the inaugural cohort of 50 Next, where judge and Spanish chef described Josh's involvement. He was a finalist in Country Style magazine's Local Hero Award. I'd like to see that picture, Josh. And was awarded a Banksia Foundation Youth as our Changemakers Award in 2022. So we're all doing our virtual claps, and we'd love to hand it over to Josh. Thank you for being part of this masterclass, Josh.
No, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. A big thank you to the Reconciliation WA team for the opportunity to present some of our research and findings. I'm here on Warramai country, which is home for me, and we say Weeaboo in our shared language here of Gatung. To greet people, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present on these lands, my uncles and aunties that still have a tremendous impact on our lands, and also extend that to all the lands in which we're joining from as well. I'm going to share a bit about our research and what our centre is and kind of what some of the themes are. But I thought before I did, I'd just like to share kind of some of my positionality around this and why these conversations are so important. Warramai country, this tract of land where I am on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, was colonised just over 200 years ago. And it was colonised by the biggest agricultural company at the time, and still one of the biggest agricultural companies that still exists, a company called the Australian Agricultural Company. They were gifted 1 million acres of our land after receiving and kind of funding £1 million back 200 years ago. And the process of their efforts on this country was really to kind of what they described in their business plan back then as to cultivate the wastelands of New South Wales was their strategic mission. And what they intended to do was graze sheep along this country and export wool back to the motherland of England. And I think that's important because it shows what the relationship was like. It's probably one of the biggest capex raises. If you think about £1 million back in the 1820s, that's quite a lot of money. But it also, I guess, shares what the relationship of our people were here. So within a very short number of years, we went from what the first chief agent of the AACO said as having this really great relationship and having to do everything in his power to protect the Indigenous nations here, to a whole range of massacres and challenging relationships. By 1827 or 1828, they were recording in their cash books that they were giving rations to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers here. And they were doing that in a rate of a seventh in that financial year, a seventh of what they would give to the horses in terms of rations. So a very odd relationship, and really, I guess, understanding what some of those early colonial wages and positionality look like in terms of power and challenging relationships here on this country. So it's those kind of yarns that I bring to these conversations around what do workplaces look like. That's not with blame It's actually to understand why the history is the way it is and what we need to take out and understand of where we are now. So I'm really pleased to be sharing this work that we call Garyella. Garyella is a Wiradjuri word that we are very thankful for a person at UTS called Lachlan McDaniel for helping arrange the wording for us. And Garyella means speak the truth. So this is very much mob sharing the truth around workplace experiences. I'll share a little bit more around how we got to this project, but just want to acknowledge before we move on from this slide, the thanks to the NAB Foundation who funded this project, both in this iteration and when it started back in 2020. So hopefully this is working like clockwork. So who we are the Centre for Indigenous People and Work. We started the centre a little bit over 12 months ago with a team of two of us to basically try and reclaim the Indigenous employment narrative in Australia. At the time, we saw a whole range of challenging perspectives and ideas that were happening in the national landscape. We had a lot of conversations that were talking about what employment should happen to Indigenous people rather than mob sharing our perspectives around what was actually happening. And if you think about the political climate that existed a number of years ago, we went from this really odd place of working for the dole and all these schemes that were trying to push mob into very terrible employment experiences to, and that trying to become a norm. And I guess we recognized that conversation really needed to move on and needed to be challenged. So I guess I remember this moment being in a remote community up in NT and somebody's working for the dole programs. One literally that we saw where people were making mud bricks and they were going through this process of making a mud brick one day. It would come out through the machine. They store it on a pallet. And the next day they would go and pick up this very same mud brick that they just made yesterday and put it back through the machine and make a mud brick and put it back down. And these were the kind of schemes that were happening right across Australia. A whole heap of non-Indigenous organisations were making a lot of money out of the Work for the Dole scheme and programs. And I guess we were really keen to help actually challenge that narrative to show that mob, through a whole heap of different methods and processes, were already engaged in work and that we were doing so often challenging, I guess, our identity or hiding our identity to be able to do that and have been doing that for a long period of time. So I share that the AA Co story to show that even from 1828 on these lands, our mob were working here, not paid properly, receiving rations and having a whole heap of terrible kind of involvements around massacres and different things that were happening on these lands. But we're still working in a system to try and stay on country and keep that connection to land here. And I think that's an important narrative that we often miss when we talk about this. So we've been doing this work for a number of years. 12 months ago, we were very fortunate to start the Centre for Indigenous People and Work. A centre within the university is actually a really interesting construct. It has its kind of remit very kind of different to the university, I guess, than a hub, which we were traditionally beforehand. So the centre is a joint collaboration between the UTS Business School and also the Jumbunna Institute. We basically self-fund all of our projects and programs and all of our research work through partners and through consulting work that we do. We have an all Indigenous advisory committee that guide our work and also hold all the data sovereignty around the work or the information that we collect. And we have a team now of 4, which has been good. We've been able to grow it a bit and hope to grow that furthermore as we continue to do this work. So within the last 12 months, we've done a whole range of different things. We've consulted for a lot of big corporates. We've been doing work around data sovereignty, particularly in terms of Indigenous employment data. We've done and released this Garyella work, which I'll share with you. We've also been trying to work out how we get better HR functions. So we have a Truth to Practice series, which I can show you as well. basically we do a whole remit of both quant and qual work, and because we do both lots of work, we're able to understand Indigenous employee experiences through both of those different remits and build upon them at each iteration. So Gabriella, this is a copy of the report. We have both a full report and a synopsis report. You're able to search for those on our website. And we also have this very quick infographic, which is also pretty helpful. They will show you, I guess, a whole range of data and information around this. As we said, this is the second report. We did the first one in 2020. And one of the important things we did and continue to do through this work is actually have an Indigenous advisory committee just for this project. So we have a range of mob who come together and we start discussing all the research questions and have a yarn around what that might look like practically. We, in the first iteration, thought we'd talk about the employee life cycle. There was a lot of work being done around actually how you can understand the journey that mob are undertaking as they both enter workplaces and move up in their careers and also leave workplaces, and understanding that. And that the first yarn that we had around with the advisory council around what this could look like, they all said to us, no, we want to talk about racism. So in 2020, we did the first report around racism and understanding those truths within workplaces. And then this year, we did both a match of those original questions that we had in 2020 and an expanded reach around a whole heap of other things we'll share today. So we often get tasked around like, where are these people from? We had 1,158 responses to Gabriella this year and 1,033 in the 2020 cohort. It probably remains one of the largest surveys of Indigenous people around their workplace experiences. And I really want to stress this point that we actually ask mob what their experiences are. We know that there's some other surveys in the field that go out and ask non-Indigenous HR managers what their Indigenous employee experiences are and then feed that back up into a national report. We're not about that. We actually want to hear from mob on the ground what is happening, what their experiences are. So the image on the left of Australia shows you this kind of the geographical dispersal. Obviously, we'd love to get more and more people, but we think 1,158 is a pretty good data set. I've got the kind of demographics on the side because we often get asked where are people at and what is the intersectional data. So you'll see that we have a very mixed group of ages and genders, sexual orientation. We have pretty good representative samples of mob with disability and also those that have caring responsibilities. So it's a pretty good data set that we draw this information from. Of course, not every data set is perfect, and we acknowledge that there's limitations, but for what we do and to try and build on the national conversation, we think it's a pretty great set. The other thing I have been thinking a lot about is how we give weight and value to each of the individual stories. And I really recognize Professor Scott Avery's work, a good Warramite academic, who has talked about individual data sets and the stories that they bring and needing to acknowledge those. And I'm really clear on and really mindful that we present that this is a very much an aggregated sample. It shows what the commonality of stories are, but it does not always, I guess, paint the picture that every unique individual has. And I think that's an important caveat whenever we look at Indigenous data and non-Indigenous data too, but particularly for mob, because I think we aggregate it so much. So what did we find? We found that most mob want to identify at work, and this is probably no surprise that almost 90% of mobs say actually we want to come out and share our identity and who we are as work, who we are at work, and we obviously encourage that through a range of different things. So we tell people within the HR space to bring your whole self to work, and this is very much, I guess, leaning in on that opportunity. The problem is that mob often don't talk about their identity at work. So only 60% of people actively talk about it, which I think this is me just like riffing, and I think it's an interesting kind of perspective to share. But so about 60% actively talk about their identity, but 40% actually actively don't talk about their identity. And I think those polarizations of data, I think, is really important to play with, because it makes me wonder, like, why are 40% not doing it, and what we need to do to help support that identity mix at work. But really, I guess the real problem is that we see in workplaces is that workplaces aren't culturally safe. So 60% of mob who were recorded in the Gariella data set said that their workplace is culturally unsafe or only moderately safe. That for us is a real challenge, that mob are going to work every day and working in places that aren't actually safe. And I think it's really important. I often say that workplaces are reflections of society, and we need to think about what that means. If you've got 60% of workplaces not safe, what are those experiences of mob within communities? And what are some of the challenges that are happening there? And certainly we know anecdotally that for a lot of mob in particularly remote and regional places, that most towns, or certainly a handful of towns, are culturally unsafe. I know our town is not the greatest, for example. So I think keeping that in mind, that often workplaces reflect society, and it gives you a good understanding of what's happening in our communities as well. And you'll see we're really big on making sure that we have a lot of qual data to support the quant work. So each of these slides will have a series of quotes that share somebody's lived experience. And that, I think, is harping back to Dr. Avery's work around saying, actually, what are the individual stories that come out here? So we're back to when we first talked about how Gariella 1 first came out in the 2020 data. We talked about racism, and what you'll see in this slide is basically racism is happening a lot. Almost 60% of mob are experiencing racism very often or sometimes. I think that for me is pretty, triggering to start with. That's the kind of first massive kind of data set that really shows that these kind of behaviors are happening at work, like, very commonly. And obviously it almost matches that culturally unsafe workplace statistic. So mob often report that they were treated unfairly because of their identity. That's kind of happens fairly often for 40%. About the same here, racial slurs or jokes at work. And there's a big cohort of people who experience stereotyping or belittling at work. Maybe just some examples, because I think, the balance between these. We worked with a workplace very recently who said they had a zero tolerance for racism at work. And they were both had both elements of a blue collar and a white collar kind of office space. And we were speaking to the blue collar mechanics and tradies around their workplace experience, and they were telling us, despite their company all having this 100% racist-free environment, they would hear racial slurs a lot, and actually, it was becoming part of the culture of that organization, and it was okay to do that. We hear a lot around mob experiencing what we call appearance racism around how mob look and what we're bringing to work, and what our elements of our culture, I guess, are coming forward as well. So these things are happening a lot, and it would be remiss of us to think that racism is just happening in society, but obviously workplaces are something that are somewhat controllable. So thinking about how we challenge racism in workplaces, for me, is really important, because we hope then that can mirror back out to society as well. We'll have some more on that later. And we often get challenged around this overt and covert forms of racism. So we know some of the covert stuff that happens is when people lodge a complaint, that often leads to further retaliation, often meaning that the person who has put in the complaint ends up leaving. People who are racist often get rewarded somehow through that system, and often the system that exists protect perpetrators. And for me, this quote down the bottom really seals the deal. That every single person I've reported for racial discrimination has been promoted. And that comes out a lot through some of the yarning circles that we have with a whole range of workplaces. The other thing we were keen on doing is understanding what cultural load or colonial load looks like. What are the elements around work that mob are doing within workplaces that often doesn't get acknowledged or noticed, or people actually turn their mind to. We've moved away from the language of cultural and colonial load because after a lot of yarning circles and qual work, people were constantly saying to us, my culture's not a load. It's the colony. It was really coming from a deficit base. People were actually really proud and saying that actually it was a cultural duty for them to share what was happening at work. So we decided to distill actually what was happening in the workplace in these very simple phrase of unpaid workplace demands. That is that it's unpaid, mob aren't getting paid for it, and it's a demand placed upon the employee by the workplace, hence the terminology. And what you'll see is some really fascinating data. And this little snapshot that you see doesn't take into account NAIDOC week or reconciliation week. We're really mindful about separating that out as separate data. So this is just in the course of the everyday, day-to-day, 365 days of the year kind of work that was happening on top of those other high cultural load or high workplace demand activities. We found that for 1 in 2, people are spending at least 1 or more hours on these activities. 1 in 3, we're working 3 or more, and for 1 in 5, about 6 or more hours. Now, these don't seem like a lot when you think about, 6 hours or even 1 hour a week. People are like, okay, that's not a lot of time. So part of our role is to actually unpack what does this mean. So for 1 in 2, what it means is that an Indigenous person will spend a whole year over the course of their career on these unpaid workplace demands. For 1 in 5, that's 6 or so more hours, equates to about 7 additional years of unpaid workplace demands placed upon Indigenous employees, completely unpaid. So that's the kind of additional load that mob are doing at work, in addition to reconciliation week and NAIDOC week activities. So it's quite large. Concerningly, not many workplaces actually recognize this, only 25%, and a high amount of people, when we compared the 2020 data set and the 2025 data set, reported a high cultural load. So because we've done this survey twice, we're really lucky to be able to understand what has changed since 2020 and 2025. We had a whole range of data that used the same questions so that we could see the impact between those two things that were happening and really kind of yarn about what the impact is happening within workplaces over that stretch. So what we found is that racism has remained high. It's probably no surprise when we had the racism rates before that racism rates haven't really changed. There's been some very minor reductions in these, but nothing, I guess, major to write home about. So mob at work are still experiencing racism, I guess, is the headline for that. The other thing we were keen on understanding is what's happening with the overt racism. And you'll see that stat that it will take 120 years to eliminate racial slurs at work. And I think that's really triggering, that the most overt form of racism that you can imagine, racial slurs, it's going to take nearly 120 years before mob get to work and just not hear a racial slur based on that rate of change. That means that we actually need high amounts of intervention now, and that we need people to be actually start having a yarn around what this conversation needs to look like and what workplaces need to proactively do to prevent racial slurs. We presented this data at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Racism Inquiry recently, and we were asked a question about, well, what about covert racism? And we reflected back to them, we absolutely think all forms of racism should be eliminated. But when the overt statistics are so high and that there's been such a slow rate of change between them, just addressing the overt stuff for us is a major kind of focus point. And we need more and more workplaces to be doing that and having those conversations so that we can try and prevent this happening so that the covert stuff can eventually be addressed. So one of the things as a result of this data and all the work that we do, it has been advocating for a positive duty on workplaces, similar to what they've done within the Sex Discrimination Act to prevent discrimination against women at work. We actually also want a very similar standard for racism for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers at work. And this data set for me, and this point particularly, really clearly shows why we need that. So we also wanted to talk about complaints procedures because we know that these are the activities that actually work within workplaces. Concerningly, workplaces, despite coming out with this data five or 6 years ago, workplaces actually haven't really done all that much. So the amount of progress that's actually happened around anti-racism activity has not been strong. Only 1 in 3 employees said their organization had a racism complaints procedure, and only about 40% said they had a relevant anti-discrimination training. These are the two things that we found had the most impact around racism at work. So concerningly, only 1 in 5 said their organization actually had both of these. And in comparison, almost 70% said their organization marks dates of significance. That's, celebrating Reconciliation Week on NAIDOC Week. So we're much more likely to do the entry-level reconciliation events at work than address the things that are actually having such a detrimental impact at mob at work, i.e. racism. So I guess the phrasing that we use here is that we want workplaces to keep marking the days of significance, but also do the areas that have a direct relationship with racism at work. And that is having both a training package and also a complaint procedure when instances do arise. And I guess, we talked about almost 60% experiencing having culturally unsafe workplaces, and about the same experiencing racism often, very often, or sometimes. Really, I guess, tragically, that only 40% feel they have the support they need when racism happens, which often means in workplaces when mob don't have the racism support that they need, they often leave or go on work health and safety leave, which actually creates a whole range of more challenging experiences as well within workplaces, and often leads to more and more stereotyping, which creates a whole heap of other sets of challenges as well. So what have we done about this? Back in the 2020 report, we consolidated the findings into these 10 truths. And fundamentally, we were trying to work out what are the 10 things that if workplaces just started on in terms of these conversations, what could we get them to do to create the biggest amount of change for mob at the workplaces? So we wanted people to start moving on with truth telling and truth acting. We wanted mob related work to be Indigenous led and informed. We wanted organizations to do the right thing in terms of their organizational principles. They needed to focus on the workplace being better rather than the employee being better, or ready to have these conversations. Identity strain is a term we came with. It showed the challenging nature of bringing your Indigenous identity to work. And we said that workplaces needed to work with their non-Indigenous employees to work out how to do some of the heavy lifting there, which I think is probably the process of reconciliation. We also wanted them to recognize that cultural load or the unpaid workplace demands and actually start paying for some of that work and recognizing it through position descriptions and things like that. We wanted workplaces to help minimize that load as well, which is number 7. Number 8 is to actually focus on long-term careers rather than short-term appointments. 9, address workplace racism. And 10, look to those high impact initiatives, particularly those 2 of anti-racism training and complaints procedures to actually have the most impact. And part of the work that we did when we started unpacking what does Gariella look like in 2025, what's the impact on these 10 truths? So within the report, we go out and we look at each one of these individual truths and what the data set looks like behind it and what change, if any, has occurred. And probably concerningly, we found that there was not a lot of impact. Very, very limited kind of changes that happened over that 5-year period. So what we decided to do because of that lack of change was to say that actually we want to reaffirm these original 10 truths, to actually say the workplaces, similar in a whole heap of other spaces, mob are still telling the truth. The truth hasn't changed. We actually just need you to move, if you think about the Reconciliation Australia journey, from truth telling to truth listening to truth acting. And actually we need workplaces to do the truth listening and the truth acting parts, because we're telling the truth and the truth has remained the same. So that for me is a fundamental piece, that things across that 5-year period haven't necessarily changed within workplaces, and we probably can reflect that they haven't really changed much in society. We have also just recently released a 10 truths about reconciliation action plans through our work. So the best part of having a really national big data set is that we're able to cut it by a whole range of different things. And one of the things that we're really keen on is to actually understand what is the impact of RAPs within workplaces for Indigenous employees. White people get really caught up on the data in this, so I'll just be really clear that we had about a 50-50 split. Not a perfect split, but around that in terms of those people that worked in workplaces that had RAPs and that had not. Apparently that's a big deal for some people, but yeah, if your data shows different, feel free to sing out, but this is what our data says. But basically we found that RAPs are linked to more culturally safe workplaces. Where a RAP exists, mob actually had a much better workplace experience. Those that work within RAP organizations were more likely to share their identity and be okay to do that. The trust within those organizations is higher. RAPs also had a lower level of racism. So where workplaces had RAPs, most mob within there reported low levels of racism across that workplace. Not perfect, but much lower, which was great. Respect is greater across the relationships, lower levels of identity strain. The actual support mechanisms, those anti-racism complaints procedures, were more common in RAP organizations. Mob were also more likely to have career development within them. Economic participation and supply diversity was also higher. And people in RAP organizations were more likely to have lower unpaid workplace demands. Basically, I think if you have a RAP or a similar framework, what this data really strongly suggests is that organizations are more likely to be focused on doing the work and being on the reconciliation journey, and that has a huge impact for mob at work and the relationship that's needed around actually just having a better workplace, but also a more safer workplace for mob to go to. So what else are we doing with all this data? We've also released these 2 reports. They're available on our Centre for Indigenous People and Work website. The first one is the RAPS report, and we've also done this series called Truth to Practice, which is a series of actual HR and manager embedded documents that talk about what's actually working at work, and what are the nuances around HR systems that should be implemented so that we have better workplaces. We've done a series of these truth to practice guides. We're about to do a conversation and a webinar around this one specifically, and we've got a backlog of a few others. So if you want some really practical hands-on tools, feel free to either email me directly or hop onto our Centre for Indigenous People and Work website so that you can actually view those truth to practice guides, and you can subscribe to them as well. We talk about this stuff all the time. I think we have a release coming up probably every 2 weeks around both Gary Gariella data and a whole range of other things that we're doing in this sector. For me, I think excitingly, some of the stuff that's coming next, we're about to release we'll release a truth to practice guide at some point that shows the youth impact and the challenges and changes that are needed within workplaces to attract and retain more young people. What we found is that a younger mob are much less likely to actually identify at work, which I think is a really challenging understanding. We know Indigenous youth is the only growing youth demographic in Australia, that will need to rely more and more on young mob to actually fulfill the roles and duties across a whole heap of workplaces. And if younger mob under the age of 25 are already going to work, not wanting to identify, that there's a real challenge there that we need to address. The other thing that we found, which is absolutely fascinating, is that young people are less likely to go for identified roles. And yeah, our way of kind of addressing some of the challenges of getting young mob is by creating these, Indigenous graduate programs, for instance. What our data says is that those programs actually won't work. Young mob don't want to identify through that process, and they're also less likely to do any unpaid workplace demands. So I think fundamentally that changing HR kind of lens and demographic is pretty pertinent around what the future of these conversations will look like and what workplaces need to do to attract and retain more Indigenous staff. I say that because I do a lot of work in agriculture, and to really self-confess that in our agricultural sector hasn't really caught up to even thinking about mob as a demographic of people that we should be thinking about as potential employees in the sector. And I think the way in which these laggard organizations will respond to trying to attract mob into the sector is by doing all the stuff that's worked 10 or so years ago. And those organizations are very quickly about to learn that mob aren't just going to put up with that. So that, the programs that they're more likely to implement are those that have worked in the past, but our young Indigenous people aren't likely to take those up. So I think that's pretty fascinating around what some of that new data is. The other thing that we've been working on is a pay parity piece. We're really keen on understanding what and where the difference of Indigenous rates of pay are. And very soon, we thought we'd have it out by now, but unfortunately we've had a few data hiccups, which is one of the joys in this space. But we'll be releasing a pay parity piece that shows basically that mob are underpaid in this space, and it really builds on the work by Jobs and Skills Australia that released a report earlier this year that said that Indigenous women receive 35% less pay than all men in Australia. And we've actually done an analysis across 227 sectors in Australia to see where those pay gaps are and what needs to do to address those. So we're pretty excited by that. I'll leave it there. Happy to yarn about this stuff all day, and also happy to hear any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Josh. Wow, what a great presentation and insights that you've done there at UTS. I just have a quick question around the Call It Out register. Is that what's coming out of your research or is that not linked at all?
We haven't been great at linking them yet. So it's certainly top of mind for us to do. We're really keen on understanding what the parallels of that might look like. But we haven't done a good job at that, and it's top of mind for us to do. So our data kind of stands alone as its own data set. I think in a perfect world, we'll use and work with Call It Out to kind of report back in, and then work with Mob who are experiencing terrible workplace experiences to provide them with the support, and then use that understanding and knowledge to help guide the work that we need to do. But yeah, we just haven't got there yet.
Are you happy if I share that in this just
Yeah, for sure.
I heard it the other day on Noongar Radio and thought it was a great initiative for sort of exactly, to combat what you found in your findings in your.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, open to the floor now. Anyone that would like to just turn on your camera, turn on your mic, and ask some questions of Josh, feel free. Open to you, our lovely members and non-members. Jodie, just
Josh, while we're waiting for some members to come through, and also please, members, you're welcome to pop your questions in the chat as well. I was really fascinated by your reflections around that the next gen aren't, or the new leaders coming through aren't interested in the, allocated roles and the 50D roles. What have you seen in your early conversations and research? What are they interested in? What have we seen any innovation in the sector that's that Mob have found attractive in that next gen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe like the data that I'm nerding out about at the moment is that the Indigenous youth demographic, like in terms of representation coming to the workforce, is so large. So just to give everyone a sense, there's a projection by Indigenous Business Australia that shows that Mob are about 3.8% of Australia's population. That could grow by 7% of Australia's population by 2041, and maybe about 8% by 2050. And to give you a sense of size and scale, that's basically the Maori population in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is what we're going to have here in Australia, which I think is pretty cool. Like 1 in 15 people in Australia will identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Like that's
Exciting.
Such a change. But for organizations, I think it's fascinating because at the same time as 1 in 15 of your consumers become Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, you're also going to have to attract probably higher levels of workplace of employees within your workplace, because the Indigenous youth demographic is so much younger, and therefore they're going to be more of your active kind of employees. So in terms of like what's going to work, I don't know, but like some of our early data is suggesting that we have a lot of mob who are entering sectors, for instance, and are leaving very quickly. An ag example shows that we get a lot of Indigenous kids between the ages of 15 and 25. And at 25, they all just leave. Over the last 4 census periods, the same statistics come across. They come in, they last for a few years, and then they all drop out and go and do something else. I think there's some sectoral nuances that's needed there. But I think also mob have just experienced and are experiencing racism at much higher rates, and in very different ways. So RA's barometer says that young mob are experiencing racism online as the predominant source. That creates a huge kind of change in how racism is targeted and what the ability is to try and address some of that. So I think all of that kind of stacked up, we're in for a really interesting time because it's such a changing demographic that we need to try and understand very quickly. And those who get in and understand at the very early level and who do that quicker will have a lot better payout, I guess, in terms of attraction and recruitment, and also retention over a long period of time, than kind of others that sit on their hands, aka agriculture.
I think you have a really interesting point there, Josh, around they're not only going to be employees, they're going to be consumers, right? So
Yeah.
there's that economic reality of what's coming down the line. And am I right that there's a massive under 18 population, as you say, so that's why we're going to get that swell in 2040. So thank you. There's some great questions coming in online, so I'll throw to Astrid to read those to you.
And maybe, sorry, just
You
quickly,
go,
like
Josh.
I think it's important to understand where the demographics are changing. So we have all these assumptions when we talk about Indigenous data, but we actually don't test it. So we're like, I remember being in this meeting a few years ago where somebody said to me, "Oh, I hear in New South Wales, for instance, all the Indigenous families live out west." And I'm like, "Well, maybe the representation out west is higher, but actually the highest growing youth demographic is on the east coast of Australia." And just like in terms of raw numbers, understanding that is really important around where you need to start attracting and recruiting, because it's not, unfortunately, in remote places, yes, there's a higher representation of mob there, but actually in terms of growth rates, it's much more East Coast centric.
Absolutely. And, if we want to see the strength of culture in young people, we only need to look to Gama over the last week. And my gosh, hasn't that filled our cups looking at that incredible cultural celebration? So anyway, back to you, Astrid.
Thanks, Jodie. Josh, can you see the questions? I mean, I'm happy to read them out, but if you can see them, it's probably easier for you to digest. So Peter Mercier, thanks for your question there. Josh, can you see that one? Do you have info on what should be included in anti-racism training for a workforce? And do you have any recommendations? Peter works at an organisation that's 25% First Nations staff.
I think so. We get asked this a lot, and one of the things I often say to workplaces is understand your own data first. Often at times we get bought into particularly big corporates, and I don't mean to pick on them, but they kind of see our data and they're like, "Oh, that's great. That's what the national average is. That's not us." And I think we often say to them, "Actually, let us come in and baseline what your Indigenous employee experience is against Gary Yalla so that we can better understand where you fit." And I'm yet to do a report where we go into a workplace and meet with their Indigenous employees and get to the employer at the end and say, "Oh yeah, your workplace is doing really well." Actually, at times we find pockets of racism, or we find that some of the data is really challenging. And what we do through our work is try and centralize and prioritize the Indigenous voice to feed back to employers. And at times, for most of them, it's the first time that they've actually heard that. So actually telling a large employer, "Yeah, you have racism, and here's some of the quotes that some of your people are saying," it is, pretty challenging, like, and pretty raw and revealing. But I think understanding your specific workplace first is a really important kind of starting part of that journey. If you want a shortcut, I think if you take the broad assumptions of Gary Alla as kind of being applicable to your workplace, because they're more likely, I guess, as the national data set suggests, that's probably what's happening in your workplace. The 10 truths for me are a really good place to start. That they really provide those initial 10 steps that you can start doing pretty quickly to understand what's happening there. And I think they tell a really interesting kind of narrative as what's needed. And maybe just the last plug I'd do is have a really key look at your retention data. Often we find organizations try and hide their retention data within workplaces by either employing a lot more mob and having high rates of churn, which is really challenging, or kind of organizations, particularly in HR, are really worried about what it means. So we'll try and like distract it or use it as kind of a broader average. So I think really being really clear to kind of understand the Indigenous employee experience that you have, particularly looking at your retention rates and then looking at the 10 truths, will provide you some really good first steps.
Thanks, Josh. And Sarah, it was sort of going to be a similar question to what I had around. Sarah Negri's just asked about some leading examples of a culturally safe, competent workplace. And I suppose like the RAP plan always helps with starting some of those, having some of those tokenistic pieces in the workplace. But, what is good or what is great, I guess, as a culturally safe workplace.
Yeah, I mean, we point to a range of examples in the Truth to Practice, particularly around specific areas. So, for instance, in the flexible work, we look at some workplaces that have flexible, not just like being able to work from home, but like what are other forms of flexibility, and we give examples of organizations that are doing that. Um, there's some good examples out there, and I think it's important to call that out. Not every workplace is perfect, but there are some that are doing some really great jobs that we should look to. The one that always comes to mind, because we've worked with them so closely, and one that I'm really proud of in terms of their journey, is Accor. Accor Hotels. They've gone through this really interesting journey where they had a really terrible set of experiences that were happening up in Alice Springs, really widely publicized. And they called us in to do a range of yarning circles with their staff to actually understand what the Indigenous employee experience was. And then we've retested that. And for me, they're an organization who have actually committed to listening to their staff, doing a whole heap of work in the meantime. And then we went out and re-listened to their staff, and then they are doing the next lot of work to help that employee experience again. And I think, I mean, it's very anecdotal, but the evidence that we've seen around that change has been really stark for me. So where they were 6 or 7 years ago, making the news headlines for all the wrong reasons. Somebody rang me recently and said, "Hey, you won't believe this. I was just at the Core Hotel. We're about to do a welcome to country, and came in to do a smoking ceremony. And the staff proactively came to me and said, 'What fire alarms do you want me to turn off so that we can facilitate that?'" That for me is a really incredible kind of shift in the way in which employees are working there. And they have become the provider for a lot of motels in New Zealand, for instance, that are Maori owned. So I think that kind of tells you about the culture that they're creating. So I'm not keen on picking champions, but I think for me, just seeing that change has certainly been something that I really kind of take my hat off to for that.
Josh, can I please add into that? I think I'd like to do a shout out to WACOS, the WA Council for Social Services. I'm a proud board member, so for complete transparency, but they've just launched an anti-racism policy. And I do think particularly for people who organisations who are really like drilling down into the new OHS policies, not so new anymore, they're 12 months old, but we do have now responsibilities for psychosocial safety across the board. And if people aren't paying attention to anti-racism, it will actually become part of your OHS risk register. And that is, it's getting real because it's legislated. So we've been looking deeply into that, but WACOS have launched and will be publicly sharing their anti-racism strategy, of which I contributed to, but I do think it's one of the best I've seen. And so they're happy to share it and for everyone to take that on board and apply it to your own organisation as by way of role model. What's your reflections, Josh, on psychosocial safety and the link to this work? Because to me, that it's now a legislative requirement, and that changes the focus for organisations.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I've been in the boardroom where that's been a challenging environment before, and decisions were made around what the impact of that was, and ultimately, staff were held accountable for that. So I think some of that work's already happening. I think there's obviously more need for that. We're really excited. The Australian, I'm going to mess up the acronym, but Work Health and Safety Organisation that the government has not long started has been a really big supporter of our Gariella data. They've been peppering us on LinkedIn, which is great, talking about the psychosocial risk of racism. And, I think more and more of these conversations are needed. We're, still pressing for a positive duty. We think it's probably the best process that's needed to actually make the real change that we need within the organizations, but certainly understanding the psychosocial risk should be a priority. And we've proactively asked organizations to put the cultural unsafety or the lack of cultural safety within their workplace on their risk register. Like we've told organizations, we really strongly want you to take this to your board. And we've had workplaces that have refuted that, or have just turned a blind eye to that recommendation. But I certainly think where we can ensure that those conversations are happening, and where our role is certainly to try and elevate these experiences so that people understand what is happening in the workplace. Well, I think that workplaces will only get better at that, and will only be stronger for that going forward.
Thanks, Josh. Peter kindly placed the document
Yes.
in the team, so you've got your tribe helping you out there, Josh.
Yeah, that's good.
So Leanne Monda, part of her question was answered with the 10 truths that you mentioned. She also just wanted to know about, she said racial slurs being present in workplaces for more than 4 generations is not okay. Is that specific workplace types, or is it higher in certain industries, for example?
Yeah, I mean, one of the joys of having a great data set is that, we can cut it many ways. We haven't yet done it by sectors as of yet. And the other thing that we keep getting asked is, can we run it by geography, and what the experiences are in, regional and remote locations compared to cities. I think there's like generally work to be done across all workplaces. The fact that it's happening in 60% of workplaces probably shows you that we need to make bigger change than not. So I think being more assumptive that it is happening within all industries is important. Certainly, our next lot of data that shows where mob are being underpaid, for instance, kind of suggests that it's happening in the majority of sectors. So it is more likely that Indigenous people are underpaid than overpaid for the work. So that suggests that even if, just racial slurs are happening in workplaces, there's often other elements that people should consider, and there's a whole massive tangent I can go past around or go down around kind of what I think that challenging space looks like and what needs to be done to address that. But I think assume that it's happening in your workplace and in your sector. Do the work that Gabriella suggests you need to do to try and circumvent it, and have good processes and procedures in place to try and stop and also address it if it does come up. I think that's the important element out of it.
Great. Peter is running a risk assessment workshop on lack of cultural safety tomorrow for her risk register. So Peter, it'd be great to know if you want to share your company with us in the chat, or even come online and share. But sounds like you're doing some wonderful things in the workplace. Any more questions?
Hi. It's on my screen, National Indigenous Australians Agency. So I don't want to.
Hey, Peter. Thank
Hi.
you for coming on.
Thanks. And as a non-Indigenous person, I've got it's taken a while to get to the workshop because of all these other considerations to make sure it's culturally safe to run. And I have a work health and safety professional in my team who's First Nations as well. So we're collaborating, but I'm also mindful of his cultural load. He's probably thinks I'm a bit over the top about it, but I'm protecting him as well. So, but yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
No, that's good as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for coming online. Any other questions for Josh before we wrap up? Or any other final words from you, Josh?
Actually, this isn't about us doing more work, but we are kind of considering what is the anti-racism practice and training that's needed within workplaces to actually specifically move to anti-racism training. So that's certainly top of mind for us, and we're trying to ground that back in Gabriella data at the moment, because we think it's important to really showcase the things that are working and to understand that space more and more and better. So we are working with a few organizations at the moment to actually start presenting that in. For me, the real challenge is that often we work with larger organizations and we meet with their head offices and provide that training at that level. But I'm worried about what the impact is on the ground, where people are kind of getting racism directly particularly from customers, I think is another interesting, fascinating point. So trying to think about actually what's happening in the workplace, not just within your employees, but also what's happening with customers is really important, and where you can actually understand any racism across both of those fields is pretty critical.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, we'll just, if there's no more questions, we'll just obviously send some claps through your emoji or love hearts or whatever emoji you wish to share with Josh. We're all open for love hearts and claps here, or if you've got anything special for Josh, please do share in the chat. I'll just quickly close out before Jodie, just to remind you all that if you are a member, thank you for joining us today. If you're not, feel free to drop me an email after this conversation that we've just had. I'll just quickly put on a last slideshow. You've got some nice messages in there for you to read. Josh, to say thank you. So just to remind you of our next programs, we've got the Wrap Ring Reflect in 2 days' time, actually. It's for members only online. Go to our website to register for that. And for all members and non-members, and we've got a wrap ready on the 11th of August. So if you're just starting out in this space, it's a great starting piece to help you on your wrap journey. So, and email is there if you want to pop through any questions regarding your membership. So I'll pass over to Jodie for closing comments. And once again, Josh, we really appreciate your time. You've obviously got some more research to be doing and more papers to write and more awards to win and more lanyards to collect by the looks. So, so thank you so much. And we look forward to following your journey on LinkedIn and all other platforms that you're on. Feel free to share those
thanks so
platforms,
much for
by the
having
way,
me.
Josh, in the chat, so we can follow your work. Jodie, for closing address.
Thank you so much, Josh. So wonderful. I got the pleasure of seeing Josh speak at our Australian Reconciliation Network meeting earlier this year, and I knew I had to get him in front of members because there was just so much richness here. And once you know about these opportunities and these organisations doing incredible work, then you can link into their work and their data on an ongoing basis. And Josh has put that link up there. So please support Gariella. I think it's an incredible initiative. And West Australian members, please. I think there's amazing kind of worksheets in there that you can access as well around creating culturally safe workplaces, and there's room for all of us to improve in that space. I did want to just do a shout out at the end. Many of you know that I'm actually leaving Reconciliation WA next Friday. Can you believe it's crept up on me very, very fast? I've had an amazing 5.5 years. I want to thank all members. This is actually my last event other than our wrap ring next in a couple of days' time. It has been an absolute honour serving you all. I stay completely committed to this work. I'm heading off to be the new State Director at the Australian Red Cross. And my work continues in earnest there. They actually have a division called First Nations Centrality. So I know that work will continue in earnest, and I remain an absolute staunch and committed ally going forward. But please, please keep up the important work of reconciliation. It is game-changing. We have to do it for the next generation of kids to succeed by choice, not by chance. And that's my ongoing work and commitment throughout the years to come. And I think this work is absolutely profound in achieving that. So please stay true to the journey, do your best work, and thanks for being on the journey with me over the last 5.5 years. It's been an absolute honour. We'll catch you around the traps. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jodie.
Thanks all.
Thanks to everyone. Bye. Bye.